In this episode, we're going to build a set of test-taking tactics that work specifically for CompTIA-style questions, especially when the wording feels slippery and the clock starts to feel loud. A lot of beginners assume that doing well on an exam is mostly about knowing facts, but on certification exams, performance is also about reading accuracy, decision discipline, and not letting stress hijack your attention. CompTIA questions often present several answers that seem reasonable, then use careful wording to reward the choice that fits the situation best, not the choice that is merely true in general. That can feel unfair until you realize it is a skill you can practice, and once you practice it, you stop being surprised by it. Time pressure makes this harder because your brain wants to rush and grab the first familiar option, which is exactly how the exam's distractors catch people. The goal today is to learn how to slow down in the right places, speed up in the right places, and keep your thinking clear even when you are unsure. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first tactic is learning to read the question as a task, not as a story, because stories can be full of details that are not equally important. Most CompTIA questions have an action hiding inside them, like identify, choose, interpret, troubleshoot, or prioritize. When you spot that action, you know what kind of thinking is being tested, and you stop wasting time trying to understand every sentence equally. A simple habit is to locate the ask before you commit your attention to the background. If the question asks for the most likely cause, you are in diagnosis mode, which means you should focus on clues and constraints rather than on broad best practices. If the question asks for the best next step, you are in sequencing mode, which means you should choose something that makes sense as a next move, not something that is a final outcome. When you treat the question as a task, your brain becomes a filter that separates key information from noise, and that makes tricky wording feel more manageable. The second tactic is paying attention to qualifiers, because qualifiers are where many correct-sounding answers become wrong. Words like best, first, most appropriate, and most effective are not just decoration. They signal that multiple answers might be partly correct, but only one aligns with the priority the question is testing. Another type of qualifier is scope, like in a specific environment, under a certain constraint, or for a certain goal. For example, if a question emphasizes minimizing false positives, that changes what a good metric or threshold choice looks like compared to a goal that emphasizes catching every true case. If a question mentions a limited dataset or a rare class, that changes what evaluation methods are appropriate. Beginners often miss these details because they read quickly and assume all questions are asking for the same kind of correctness. Training yourself to hunt for qualifiers early keeps you from picking an answer that is correct in general but wrong for that question. A third tactic is to predict the shape of the answer before you look at the options, because options can manipulate your attention. When you read the question and immediately look down at the choices, you are letting the choices drive your thinking. Instead, after you understand the ask and the key facts, pause and imagine what a correct answer would have to include. You do not need exact words. You just need a mental description, like it should mention choosing a metric that handles class imbalance, or it should mention checking for data leakage, or it should mention interpreting a confidence interval correctly. Now, when you look at the options, you are matching them to your predicted shape instead of being impressed by fancy phrases. This reduces the power of distractors that use advanced vocabulary to sound authoritative. It also saves time, because you can eliminate choices that do not match the expected shape without deeply analyzing them. Prediction turns you from a passive reader into an active solver. A fourth tactic is understanding the difference between an answer that is true and an answer that answers the question. CompTIA loves true statements that are not the best response, because those statements tempt people who recognize buzzwords. For instance, a choice might mention a common best practice, but if the question is asking for a root cause, a best practice might be irrelevant. Another choice might describe a valid method, but if the question's constraints make that method inappropriate, then it is not the correct selection. This is where you use the question's qualifiers like a lock and the answer choices like keys, because only one key fits the lock exactly. Beginners often look for correctness as in, is this statement accurate? But the exam is asking for correctness as in, is this the best fit for this situation? When you shift to best fit, you stop rewarding choices just for being familiar or generally respected. Your goal becomes to satisfy the ask with the least assumption and the closest alignment to the scenario. Time pressure makes all of this harder, so you need tactics that protect your clock without sacrificing accuracy. One key habit is to know when a question is becoming a time sink, because some questions are designed to slow you down. A time sink often happens when you cannot decide between two options after your first pass, and you start rereading the same lines over and over. That loop feels productive, but it is usually not, because it is driven by anxiety, not by new information. When you notice the loop, your job is to break it by taking an action, like marking the question to revisit later or making the best choice you can and moving on. You are not trying to win every battle. You are trying to win the war of total points. Spending 4 minutes on one question can cost you multiple easier questions later, and that trade-off is rarely worth it. A steady rhythm is a scoring strategy, not just a comfort strategy. A useful way to keep rhythm is to adopt a two-pass approach in your mind, even if you never consciously label it during the exam. In the first pass, you answer what you can answer confidently and quickly, and you avoid investing heavy time in anything that feels uncertain. In the second pass, you return to the uncertain items with whatever time you have protected. This works because uncertainty is not always permanent. Sometimes other questions jog your memory, and sometimes your brain settles after the initial stress. The first pass also builds confidence, because you are accumulating wins instead of fighting only the hardest items. Beginners often do the opposite, trying to solve every question fully on the first encounter, which causes time collapse later. The two-pass mindset gives you permission to keep moving and prevents one tricky question from controlling your entire session. Another tactic is careful elimination, because elimination turns uncertainty into probability in a way that helps you score. If you can remove two clearly wrong options, you have improved your odds dramatically, even if you still feel unsure. Elimination is faster than trying to prove a single choice correct from scratch, especially when choices are similar. To eliminate, look for mismatch with the ask, mismatch with constraints, and mismatch with basic definitions. If the question is about evaluating classification performance and an option describes a regression metric, that is a mismatch you can remove quickly. If the question stresses interpretability and an option implies a black box approach without justification, that may be a mismatch with the scenario goal. Elimination is not a trick. It is a disciplined way to reduce noise so the remaining decision becomes clearer. It also reduces stress because you can see progress, even when the final choice is still hard. CompTIA wording also uses negative constructions sometimes, and negatives are a common source of mistakes under time pressure. If you see wording like which of the following is not, least likely, or would not, your brain can easily skip the negative word while reading. The fix is to consciously mark the negative in your mind as you read, almost like highlighting it with attention. Another helpful habit is to rephrase the question into a positive form in your head, like it is asking you to find the exception or the incorrect statement. This small mental rewrite reduces misreads and makes elimination easier because you are searching for what stands out. Negatives can also appear in the choices themselves, and double negatives can confuse anyone when they are stressed. Slow down just enough to avoid the classic error of answering the opposite of what was asked. A single misread like that can cost you points you actually earned through studying. You also want to watch for absolute words, because absolute words often signal wrong answers unless the scenario supports them strongly. Words like always, never, guaranteed, and completely are risky because real-world systems and real-world data rarely behave with perfect certainty. That does not mean absolute answers are always wrong, but it does mean you should be cautious and check whether the scenario truly demands that level of certainty. In data and AI topics, this matters because metrics have trade-offs, models have uncertainty, and data has limitations. A choice that promises to eliminate all bias or guarantee perfect accuracy should make you skeptical unless the question is clearly testing a narrow definition where such words make sense. This is not about cynicism. It is about realism. The exam rewards the option that reflects how the concept actually behaves, not how we wish it behaved. A particularly tricky area in data AI questions is when the exam tests concepts that sound similar but have different meanings, like accuracy versus precision, correlation versus causation, or statistical significance versus practical significance. Under time pressure, similar-sounding ideas blur together, and that is where the exam's wording becomes a trap. Your tactic here is to anchor on what each term measures and what it ignores. For example, accuracy is a broad measure that can hide poor performance on a minority class, while precision focuses on how many predicted positives were actually correct. Statistical significance is about evidence against a null model under assumptions, while practical significance is about whether the effect matters in the real world. When you train your brain to think in terms of what a term measures and what it ignores, you can separate close options quickly. This is why understanding beats memorization, because understanding creates distinctions you can apply under pressure. Another high-value tactic is knowing when to trust your first well-reasoned answer and when to change it. People often hear advice like never change your first answer, but the better rule is never change without a specific reason tied to the question. If you reread and notice you misread a qualifier, that is a valid reason to change. If you remember a definition you forgot, that is a valid reason to change. If you are changing because anxiety spiked and an option sounded more advanced, that is usually not a valid reason. Under time pressure, random switching can turn correct answers into wrong ones. So the tactic is to make your initial choice with a clear reason, even if the reason is elimination, and then only overturn it if you find new information that clearly beats your earlier reasoning. This keeps you from second-guessing yourself into a worse score. Finally, treat time pressure as a problem you manage, not as a force that manages you, because your emotional response affects your reading and your decisions. When the clock feels tight, your body wants to speed up, and speeding up often reduces comprehension, which then causes rereading, which then wastes time. A calmer approach is to keep a steady pace and use strategic decisions like skipping time sinks, eliminating options quickly, and returning later. If you notice stress building, use a short mental reset between questions, like a deliberate breath and a reminder that one hard question does not predict your final score. The exam is a long sequence, and consistency is what wins. These tactics are not about gaming the test. They are about protecting your understanding from stress so the knowledge you have can actually show up on the screen. When you combine these habits, tricky wording becomes less mysterious because you have a repeatable way to handle it. You read for the task, you capture qualifiers, you predict the answer shape, and you separate true statements from true answers. You manage time by avoiding loops, using a two-pass mindset, and using elimination to increase your odds when you are unsure. You handle negatives and absolutes carefully, and you anchor similar terms by focusing on what each measures and what it ignores. You also maintain decision discipline by changing answers only for clear reasons, not for emotional ones. If you practice these tactics while you study content, they become automatic, and automatic is exactly what you want under time pressure. With a steady method in place, you can focus more of your mental energy on reasoning through data AI concepts and less on wrestling with the exam experience itself.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.